It's a pleasure as a Stanford alum to come to the Berkeley campus. How about that big game? Broke our 4-game losing streak. um, I'm going to talk about animals greater than 6 inches tall, which makes this different from the rest of the presentation. But I'm a physician scientist. I started the Institute for Historical Ecology. We study California's historical flora and fauna and their distribution, much of which was poorly understood, to guide restoration and rewilding. I'm pleased to see Save Mount Diablo as restore in the middle of their byline, because a lot of land trusts conserve lands, which is an important first step, but I think need to focus on rewilding. There are two native mammals in California that help mitigate wildfires: elk and beaver. Beaver because their streams and ponds may provide barriers to fires and provide water sources and for firefighters, actually. And elk because they mow the grass. On the right, I've published 4 papers on elk in California, largely calling for their recovery and restoration, and talking about how they're often blocked by freeways from recolonizing the rest of the state. They reduce fire fuel loads. This is why I would argue elk are especially important in enclosure or exclosure studies where you have any of our native grazers, bison, elk, moose even, flame heights are much lower and spread rates are much slower because the fire fuel loads are reduced. It's especially powerful if you do a prescribed or cultural burn first and then introduce your native grazer. So the combination, or pyrrhic herbivory, particularly useful. Elk are also important just because they're charismatic megafauna. And people will pay money to come see them. I'm not proposing we create a zoo, but at Oregon's Jewel Meadows Wildlife Area, they had a problem. In winter, the elk would come down and depredate the neighboring alfalfa fields. And so they started buying alfalfa and putting bales on the refuge. And for $200,000 worth of feed, $6.5 million worth of parking and visitors fees were generated. So you could actually put a dollar value on wildlife viewing. I think it was 2011, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey. California made about 11 billion in wildlife viewing versus about 1.2 billion on hunting fees. So a lot of money on wildlife viewing. At Point Reyes was where elk were restored around 1978. They are mowing the grass and changing the grasslands, taking out invasive. In Pacheco State Park, where just west of San Luis Reservoir, where they've reached great numbers now, you see bunch grasses coming back. And they're a missing prey item from much of our landscape. Wolves, bears, puma feed on them. Coyote take their calves. Elk carcasses are important for obligate scavengers, including condors. We still have supplemental feeding stations for condors because we don't have large ungulates roaming our landscape in California. But let's talk about fire. In this study, you see high fire fuel loads leading to a really big flame and no grazers, of course, and the tree will burn to the ground because the fine shrub will ignite the forest canopy, and you'll get a canopy fire. On the bottom, in the browsed ecosystem, the crown does not ignite. The tree survives. The carbon stays sequestered because the grass is mowed and the shrubs are mowed. And this is happening at Point Reyes, right? The scrublands are becoming grasslands. Other places where there aren't elk, you see the Douglas fir re-encroaching. This is the 2018 California Department of Fish and Wildlife, CDFW, elk management plans map of our historic elk subspecies in California. In pinkish purple is Tule Elk. These are all now, this is historical. They were hunted down to just 2 or 3 animals, which survived in the South San Joaquin Valley. Now we have 6,000. They are genetic siblings, right? They're all descended from 2 to 3 individuals. In the northwest, we have Roosevelt elk, or Rusi. They're the largest of the elk subspecies. And then the northeast, Rocky Mountain elk. The historic map in the 2018 plan omitted the Sierra Nevada as historic elk habitat. We proved that was wrong. And they are now recolonizing the northern Sierra Nevada with an elk herd at Stampede Reservoir, about 18 miles north of Tahoe and coming south. So I should have acknowledged the North Santa Clara County Resource Conservation District funded the habitat suitability analysis we did for Tule elk in the Bay Area, which will come up in a little bit. But we have elk in Santa Clara County because the Hewlett-Packard bought a ranch on Mount Hamilton, the San Felipe Ranch, and in 1978 worked with CDFW to get some Tule elk back. When they released them, they left immediately and went north to San Antonio Reservoir.
San Antonio Reservoir.
They went to the reservoir. Important to remember that. The next year they tried again, 1979. They went east there, Isabel Valley. There's some nice marshlands. They've gone a little further east since then, and now that we have an ecological reserve protecting the elk up in the San Antonio Valley. 1980, they try again, and they went to San Luis Reservoir. In 1981, they penned the elk on their ranch until they calved, and they stayed. And those elk, now often you see, if you know to look, as you drive south on 101, you look to your left, and they stayed. In the drought in recent years, 2 golf courses closed in southeast San Jose because they couldn't pay the water bills. And elk moved in literally within weeks, and they used the water holes on the golf courses. In the city limits of San Jose, we have elk herds. Now, where are the elk today? So the 2018 elk management plan shows in pink purple where the Tule elk have been restored. Basically, we have islands of elk, of Tule elk. The Roosevelt elk have moved back down and are now touching and admixing with the Tule elk on the coast. In the northeast, they thought these were Rocky Mountain elk that were starting to march south. Genetic studies by Ben Sachs at UC Davis, turns out these elk recolonized in the northern Sierra are about 3/4 Roosevelt elk and about 1/4 Rocky Mountain. So they're an admixture. Oops. And there was an elk herd in the Concord Naval Weapons Station in 1978. They relocated them to Grizzly Island. That herd. They relocated. One elk swam back to Contra Costa County. And they relocated him back to Grizzly Island. But look at this. Thousands of elk in William Heath Davis, this historical observer record, hundreds of elk crossing from Mare Island, basically the Napa side, across the Carquinez Strait to Contra Costa County. So they can swim long distances. They can cross the strait without difficulty. And as you think about wildlife linkages, don't forget you've got a big elk herd just north of you at Grizzly Island. But our highways are a problem. So courtesy of Professor Fraser Schilling at UC Davis and the Road Ecology Center, I asked him for a map of elk vehicle collisions, which would be the red dots. The green dots are black-tailed deer, and the brown dots are coyote. As you see, the black-tailed deer are really stupid. They cross all the roads, and they get hit all the time. But the elk don't cross the road. They don't cross 101, they don't cross 580, and they don't cross that little bit of 680. It connects and goes up and bisects the North Diablo Range. They're getting hit here at the Jaco Pass. I believe this is because here the traffic is intermittent, especially at night. It's high speed and intermittent, but on the interstates, it's relatively constant traffic, and so the elk aren't crossing. There's one red dot down there in Salinas, again, east of 101. So we can't get elk west of Highway 101 or north of Interstate 580. Although the Alameda County RCD is working diligently on wildlife over and under crossings for many species. But what are the yellow dots? Don't know. It's actually northwestern pond turtles. So Thomas Connor, working with Justin Brashear's group here at Berkeley, did the habitat suitability analysis, looked at characteristics of San Luis Reservoir Tule Elk. Big herds there. They go back and forth. These little clouds are where existing Tule Elk herds are. As you see, none north of 580 nor west of 101. They are west of 101 way down in southern Monterey County because they were translocated to Fort Hunter Liggett, where they were poached to 0. But then they tried again, and that they now have hundreds of elk there. And we're looking at the characteristics of San Luis Reservoir elk, then predicting where is the good Tule elk habitat. And son of a gun, the best part is Mount Diablo. But the Diablo Range, the Gablands, this big area of the Santa Cruz Mountains that has no dots is because they don't like the forest. They abhor redwood forest. Right? These Tule elk survived from the Tule marshes. That's why we call them Tule elk in the South San Joaquin Valley, and they have they don't like forest. Unlike Roosevelt elk, which love the redwood forest. But the thin strand along the coastal grasslands, the inland side of the Santa Cruz Mountains, the East Bay Hills, and the rest of the Diablo Range, all good elk habitat. They go back and forth in Santa Clara County from San Luis Reservoir, which is Santa Clara Merced, to Anderson Reservoir, Creek, south of San Jose. And the next slide shows even more vividly. The greatest concentration is north of Interstate 580. It is the North Diablo Range, habitat quality-wise. In Santa Clara County, they go to the reservoirs because they love the green up. In the late summer and fall, the grasses become desiccated, but the reservoirs are receding, and forbs and grasses are coming up, and they love that green up, and they follow the reservoirs as they recede. That's important because when they do cross 580, where are they going to go? They're going to go to Las Vaqueras, I predict. So you have a patchwork. This is a map of conserved lands. And the Alameda County RCD is working on crossings that will enable them to hopefully reach these Bay Hills. They'll have a couple barriers, perhaps 680 and 580, and then 580 again. But I think really important, if we don't have the species back, our wildfire problems will be worse. One of our publications worked with Tom Batter, California Fish and Wildlife, elk and pronghorn specialist, and many other academic and wildlife biologists that study elk, to show the elk go under roads. A lot of people say, oh, elk like only to go over, you have to build these expensive overcrossings. No, they go under. This is a medium-sized bridge. We used to calculate the openness ratio, the height versus the width and the depth or the length under the bridge. And it is probably true that bigger is better for elk to go under, but the real characteristic we found in all of the elk undercrossings that we recorded, all 3 California elk subspecies go under roads. The common characteristic was this, an intermittent stream. They love to follow these as game trails, apparently. And the smallest opening was this culvert at Fort Hunter Liggett. The red arrow is pointing at the trail cam. We have video of a herd of elk going through this. The bull is like, oh, I'm trying not to scratch his head on the roof. I don't think I don't know why they did that. I mean, they can jump an 8-foot fence. And this barbed wire fence doesn't even go that far on the two sides. They can just go around, but they followed this little spindly trail and went through. So bigger's probably better, but presence of an intermittent stream should be factored into your thinking about wildlife linkage under crossings. Elk can cause problems. They can break fences. Bull elk can do a belly flop on a barbed wire fence with impunity and flatten it for the rest of the herd. When they frequently break a fence in the same spot, you can put in these H-frame style wooden crossings where it's lower. The top horizontal board might be 30 inches as opposed to, 40-inch high barbed wire. And it probably works half the time. You can see the herd of elk in the background there. This is Mendocino County. They have private elk hunts now. $20,000 for a bull, for a tag to hunt a bull. $5,000 for a cow, because those cows, elk cows, don't have antlers. So it's a premium. But generating money. 3 of my 5 sons live in Montana. This is Gardner, Montana. I think it's unusual. Normally elk are shy of humans, but this is just north of Yellowstone, and they have acclimated to the Gardner High School football team, and they sit in the end zone. So a lot of people ask me, are they going to eat my garden? And in Missoula, where my boys live, they do have elk in the city, but it's the deer that are eating their gardens, not the elk. But I hope you'll share my enthusiasm. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Rick. Any questions? First of all, go Bears, beat Stanford. Next year. That was pretty interesting for a Stanford grad. I'm curious. I am curious about the genetic diversity. It started with a small group of 2 or something you said. That's pretty dangerous country.
It is. So we have elk with antlers coming out of their eyebrows. We call them unicorn elk. The Tule Elk are ridiculous. It's amazing they've done as well as they have. We're up to about 6,000 Tule Elk, about 6,000 Roosevelt. I don't know. But Ben Sack's genetic study just a year or 2 years ago showed that they're admixing everywhere. In Fort Tejon, right on Interstate 5, you should go up to Grapevine. That rancher got some elk from greater Yellowstone area. Those are Rocky Mountain elk. They broke the fences. They're colonizing the Tehachapi's and up into the southern Sierra now, up to Lake Isabella. But one of them crossed Interstate 5 and is in the Windwells Preserve on the west side, from the east side to the west side. One bull crossed and is in the middle of this big Tule Elk, has a harem of female Tule Elk. So in San Simeon, William the First brought Roosevelt elk down and released them. And although the Tule Elk are 400 liget won't cross through the redwoods in the Coast Range to go to the delicious grasslands, those Roosevelt elk have crossed through and are now mixing inland with the Tule Elk. So we're getting genetic diversity whether we plan on it or not, because we made this gamish of elk subspecies.
So my family is up in we're right where the Tule Elk herd is at the northeasternmost point, so kind of where 580 does the corner up between Tracy and Livermore. And so when I was growing up, the Tule Elk were much more higher in the foothills. We saw them a lot in the foothills. They ranged further south that we saw. And that herd now mostly sits down in the valley floor, really doesn't range far south, doesn't go up into the foothills. Have there been kind of any observations about changes in behavior over like decades with the Tule Elk where they're actually not ranging as far? Or is this just kind of unique to a particular herd, or any information about that?
I think it's because we have a lot of poaching. And not far from that Hewlett-Packard Ranch, there's a elk graveyard. And it's all these elk skeletons, but no antlers. So I think there's a lot of poaching. I don't think it's the ranchers. I think it's city people that go out and poach. We see people chasing elk with ATVs. So I think these factors have make it probably almost impossible to figure out the answer to the question. There's so much human interference now. In Missoula, as you see, you could walk right up to an elk. In Santa Clara County, if they see you from 5 miles away, they run the opposite. They'll disappear to the very next ridge before you even get a chance. And I think it's because of human interference is driving a lot of these funny behaviors.
So in Point Reyes, as they take the cattle off, and there's concern that the coyote brush is going to remove the grassland there, so you're feeling that the Tule elk are actually going to, do they graze on and keep out the coyote brush, or is it expected to take over?
If you go to Tomales Point, where they were fenced in by that 12-foot fence until recently, it's just lupins and grasslands and forbs. And then they established it, done a lemon tour. They brought some before they breached the fence, and same thing's happening. The scrub is going away. It's becoming grasslands and forbs. And when they eat bunch grass, they don't chew it to the ground like sheep. They don't uproot it like cattle might when it gets moist. They'll uproot and eat the roots. Our Tule elk co-evolve with the bunch grasses. So they nip it and don't kill it, and the root system goes to about 4 times bigger because they're pruning it, sequestering a huge amount of carbon versus bunch grass that isn't grazed by elk, but the root system's much smaller. So I think we just have to put the right species with the right species of plant and animal to get the greatest benefits.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.